If you want to understand how America truly won its independence, you need to hear this story. Because what most people don't know is that the American Revolution wasn't won on the battlefields of Lexington, Saratoga, or Yorktown. It was won in the palaces of Europe, in the salons of Paris, in the calculated decisions of kings and philosophers who saw in America something that would change the world forever. December 1777. A swift-sailing ship from Boston arrived in France carrying news that would shake the foundations of the world. General Burgoyne had surrendered. The British Army, considered the most professional fighting force on earth, had been defeated by colonial farmers and merchants who barely knew how to hold a musket a year before. When this news reached Paris, Turgot and all of France exploded into transports of joy. Nobody doubted anymore. The Americans could win. They could actually maintain their independence. On December 12th, the American commissioners had an interview with Vergennes, the French Minister of Foreign Affairs. Picture this moment. These colonial representatives, dressed in their simple American clothes, standing before one of the most powerful men in Europe. And Vergennes said something that would echo through history. Nothing has struck me so much as General Washington attacking and giving battle to General Howe's army. To bring troops raised within the year to this promises everything. Then he said something even more remarkable. The court of France, in the treaty which is to be entered into, intends to take no advantage of your present situation. Once made, it should be durable, and therefore it should contain no condition of which the Americans may afterward repent, but such only as will last as long as human institutions shall endure, so that mutual amity may subsist forever. Think about that. Here was one of the great powers of Europe offering to treat with rebel colonists, not as supplicants, not as desperate refugees begging for help, but as equals, as a sovereign nation. But there were complications. Entering into a treaty will be an avowal of your independence, Vergennes explained. Spain must be consulted, and Spain will not be satisfied with an undetermined boundary on the west. Some of the states are supposed to run to the South Sea, which might interfere with her claim to California. The Americans answered that the last treaty of peace adopted the Mississippi as a boundary. Then Vergennes asked the question that revealed true French interests. And what share do you intend to give us in the fisheries? You see, in the original draft of a treaty, the United States had proposed to take to themselves Cape Breton and the whole of the island of Newfoundland. The American commissioners made explanations that their later instructions removed all chances of disagreement on that subject. But here's what's remarkable. The return of the courier to Spain was not waited for. 5 days later, on December 17th, Girard, one of Vergennes' secretaries, informed Franklin and Dean that the king in council had determined not only to acknowledge the United States, but to support their cause. And in case England should declare war against France on account of this recognition, he would not insist that the Americans should make a separate peace, but only that they should maintain their independence. The American commissioners answered, "We perceive and admire the king's magnanimity and wisdom. He will find us faithful and firm allies. We wish with His Majesty that the amity between the two nations may last forever." And both parties agreed that good relations could continue between a monarchy and a republic. Let that sink in. A monarchy and a republic, natural enemies according to every political theory of the age, agreeing that they could be allies, that they could be friends. In January 1778, the French king promised 3 million of livres. As much more, it was said, would be remitted by Spain from Havana. But Spain, that's where the story gets complicated. The Spanish government, while devoted to the union between the crowns of France and Spain, wanted nothing to do with a rupture with England. To Count Montmorin, the French ambassador at Madrid, Floridablanca said with warmth, "Your court is disposed to treat with the Americans. War will result from it, and the war will have neither an object for its beginning nor a plan for its end." Spain saw what France refused to see. This wasn't just about taking revenge on England. This was about something far more dangerous to monarchy itself.
the recognition of rebel colonies, the acknowledgement that people could throw off their kings and govern themselves. The reports from Versailles reached Leopold of Tuscany and Joseph of Austria. Joseph predicted before the end of January, the women and the enthusiasm of the moment, putting the ministers in fear of losing their places, will determine them to make war on the English, and they could commit no greater folly. He understood. While the two greatest countries in Europe were running a race for the favor of the Americans, they were playing with fire. The question of a French alliance was discussed by Vergennes with the Marquis d'Auxonne, the late French ambassador in Madrid, as the best advisor with regard to Spain, and the plan of action was formed. Then these two met the king at the apartment of Maurepas, where the plan, after debate, was finally settled. Maurepas, at heart opposed to the war, loved ease and popularity too well to escape the sway of external opinion. And Louis XVI sacrificed his own inclination, his own feeling of justice, to policy of state and the opinion of his advisors. So on February 6, 1778, a treaty of amity and commerce and an eventual defensive treaty of alliance were concluded between the King of France and the United States on principles of equality and reciprocity, and for the most part in conformity to the proposals of Congress. In commerce, each party was to be placed on the footing of the most favored nation. The King of France promised his good offices with the princes and powers of Barbary. As to the fisheries, each party reserved to itself the exclusive possession of its own. Accepting the French interpretation of the treaties of Utrecht and of Paris, the United States acknowledged the right of French subjects to fish on the banks of Newfoundland and their exclusive right to half of the coast of that island for drying places. On the question of ownership in the event of the conquest of Newfoundland, the treaty was silent. The American proposal that free ships give freedom to goods and to persons except to soldiers in actual service of an enemy was adopted. Careful lists were made out of contraband merchandises. The absolute and unlimited independence of the United States was described as the essential end of the defensive alliance, and the two parties mutually engaged to not lay down their arms until it should be assured by the treaties terminating the war. Moreover, the United States guaranteed to France the possessions then held by France in America, as well as those which it might acquire by a future treaty of peace. And in like manner, the King of France guaranteed to the United States their present possessions and acquisitions during the war from the dominions of Great Britain in North America. A separate act reserved to the King of Spain the power of acceding to the treaties. Within 42 hours of the signature of these treaties of commerce and alliance, the British ministry received the news by a special messenger from their spy in Paris, but it was not divulged. They kept it secret. Why? Because they knew what it meant. It meant they had lost. Back in England, on February 11th, Hillsborough asked the Duke of Richmond in what manner he meant that England should crouch to the vipers and rebels in America, by giving up the sacred right of taxation, or by yielding to her absurd pretensions about her charters, or by declaring the 13 provinces independent.
Richmond answered with words that would have been considered treason just a few years before. I never liked the Declaratory Act. I voted for it with regret to obtain the repeal of the Stamp Act. I wish we could have done without it. I looked upon it as a piece of waste paper that no minister would ever have the madness to revive. I will with pleasure be the first to repeal it or to give it up. In this mood, Richmond sought harmony with Chatham. On the same day, in the House of Commons, George Grenville attacked the administration in the harshest terms and pointed out Lord Chatham as the proper person to treat with America. The very sincere and glowing words of eulogy spoken by the son of the author of the stamp tax were pleasing to Lord Chatham in these his last days. While the British government stumbled in the dark, Franklin was placing the public opinion of philosophical France conspicuously on the side of America. No man of that century so embodied the idea of toleration as Voltaire. For fame he was unequaled among living men of letters. For great age he was venerable.
He, more than Louis XVI or the cabinet of the king, represented France of that day, and he was come up to Paris, bent with years, to receive before his death the homage of its people. Wide indeed was the difference between him and America. Voltaire, the skeptic, the mocker of religion, the champion of reason above all. America, deeply religious, built on Protestant faith and biblical principles, but for the moment they were in harmony, and before he had been a week in Paris, Franklin claimed leave to wait upon him. We have Voltaire's account of the interview. Franklin bade his grandson demand the benediction of the more than octogenarian, and in the presence of 20 persons he gave it in these words, "God and liberty." 2 words that captured everything, 2 words that united the religious fervor of America with the philosophical passion of France. Everywhere Voltaire appeared as the friend of America. Being in company where the wife of Lafayette was present, he asked that she might be brought to him, kissed her hand, and spoke to her the praises of her husband and of the cause in which he served. Almost simultaneously, Lord North on February 17th made known to the House of Commons the extent of his conciliatory propositions. Of the 2 bills, one declared the intention of the Parliament of Great Britain not to exercise the right of imposing taxes within the colonies of North America. The other authorized commissioners to be sent to the United States. In a speech of 2 hours, Lord North avowed that he had never had a policy of his own. He had never proposed any tax on America. He had found the tea tax imposed, and while he had not moved its repeal, he never devised means to enforce it. The commissioners would have power to treat with Congress, with provincial assemblies, or with Washington, to order a truce, to suspend all laws, to grant pardons and rewards, to restore the Constitution as it stood before the Troubles. When he finished speaking, a dull, melancholy silence succeeded to the speech. It had been heard with profound attention, but without a single mark of approbation to any part of it from any party or man in the House. Astonishment, dejection, and fear overclouded the assembly. After the House of Commons gave leave to bring in the bills, Hartley, acting on an understanding with Lord North, enclosed copies of them to Franklin. Franklin, with the knowledge of Vergennes, answered with brutal clarity, "If peace by a treaty with America upon equal terms is really desired, your commissioners need not go there for it. If wise and honest men, such as Sir George Savile, the Bishop of Asaph, and yourself, were to come over here immediately with powers to treat, you might not only obtain peace with America, but prevent a war with France." But it was too late. The conciliatory bills, which with slight modifications became statutes by nearly unanimous consent, confirmed the ministry in power. The King of France, from regard to his dignity, made a formal declaration to Great Britain of his treaties with the United States. British ships of war had captured many French ships, but the ministry had neither communicated the instructions under which their officers acted, nor given heed to the reclamations of the French government.
The rescript, which on March 13th was left by the French ambassador with the British Secretary of State, announced that the United States of North America are in full possession of independence, which they had declared on the 4th of July, 1776. That to consolidate the connection between the 2 nations, their respective plenipotentiaries had signed a treaty of friendship and commerce, but without any exclusive advantages in favor of the French nation. The king is determined to protect the lawful commerce of his subjects, and for that purpose has taken measures in concert with the United States of North America. This declaration established a state of war between England and France. The British ambassador was immediately recalled, and the recall notified to the French ambassador. Lord North became despondent and professed a desire to make way for Lord Chatham. The king, on the 15th, answered with the fury of a man who saw his world collapsing.
On a clear explanation that Lord Chatham is to step forth to support you, I will receive him with open arms. I will only add, to put before your eyes my most inmost thoughts, that no advantage to my country nor personal danger to myself can make me address myself to Lord Chatham or to any other branch of opposition. I would rather lose the crown I now wear than bear the ignominy of possessing it under their shackles. Fox would have consented to a coalition had it been agreeable to his friends. Shelburne answered instantly, "Lord Chatham must be the dictator. I know that Lord Chatham thinks any change insufficient which does not comprehend a great law arrangement and annihilate every party in the kingdom." The king, when this reply was reported to him, broke out with violence. "Lord Chatham, that perfidious man, as dictator? Nothing shall bring me to treat personally with Lord Chatham. Experience makes me resolve to run any personal risk rather than submit to a set of men who certainly would make me a slave for the remainder of my days." After a night's rest, the king wrote with still more energy, "No consideration in life shall make me stoop to opposition. I will rather risk my crown than do what I think personally disgraceful. If the nation will not stand by me, they shall have another king, for I will never put my hand to what will make me miserable to the last day of my life." This was a king losing his mind, a king watching his empire crumble and refusing to accept reality. On the 17th, the king communicated to Parliament the rescript of the French ambassador. In the Commons, Conway said, "What have we to do but, with fairness and manliness, to take up the idea that Franklin has thrown out?" In the Lords, Rockingham advised to break the alliance between France and the United States by acknowledging American independence. Richmond still hoped to avoid a war. Lord Shelburne dwelt on the greatness of the affront offered by France and the impossibility of not resenting it, yet he would not listen to a private overture from the ministers. Without Lord Chatham, any new arrangement would be inefficient. With Lord Chatham, nothing could be done but by an entire new cabinet and a change in the chief departments of the law. On the report of this language, the king wrote his last word to Lord North. "Rather than be shackled by these desperate men, I will see any form of government introduced into this island and lose my crown than wear it as a disgrace." March 20th, 1778, was the day appointed for the presentation of the American commissioners to the King of France in the palace built by Louis XIV at Versailles. The world thought only of Franklin, but he was accompanied by his two colleagues and by the unreceived ministers to Prussia and Tuscany. These four glittered in lace and powder, dressed in the elaborate court fashion of European diplomacy. But Franklin, the patriarch, was dressed in the plain gala coat of Manchester velvet, which he had used at the levee of George III. The same coat which, according to the custom of that age, he had worn, as it proved, for the last time in England, when, as agent of Massachusetts, he had appeared before the Privy Council. White stockings, spectacles on his nose, a round white hat under his arm, and his thin gray hair in its natural state. No powder, no wig, no pretense. The crowd through which they passed received them with long-continued applause. The people of France, the common people, understood what was happening. They were witnessing history. The king, without any unusual courtesy, said to them, "I wish Congress to be assured of my friendship." After the ceremony, they paid a visit to the wife of Lafayette and dined with the Secretary of Foreign Affairs. 2 days later, they were introduced to the still youthful Marie Antoinette, who yielded willingly to generous impulses in behalf of Republicans, and by her sympathy made the support of America a fashion at the French court. But the king, Louis XVI, felt all the while as if he were wronging the cause of monarchy itself by his acknowledgement of rebel republicans. He engaged in the American Revolution against his own will, only because members of his cabinet insisted that it was his duty to France to take revenge on England. Personally, he was irritated and did not disguise his vexation. The praises lavished on Franklin by those around the Queen fretted him to peevishness, and he mocked what seemed to him the pretentious enthusiasm of the Countess Diana de Polignac. The king's instincts were right. He was signing the death warrant of monarchy in France. Within 15 years, he would lose his head to the guillotine, a victim of the very republican ideas he was now supporting in America. The peak of the king was in no degree due to any defect in Franklin. He was a man of the soundest understanding, never disturbed by recollections or fears, by capricious anxieties or the susceptibilities of self-love. Free from the illusions of poetic natures, he loved truth for its own sake and saw things as they were. As a consequence, he had no eloquence but that of clarity. He knew the moral world to be subjected to laws like the natural world. In conducting affairs, he remembered the necessary relation of cause to effect, aiming only at what was possible. And with a tranquil mind, he signed the treaty with France, just as with calm observation he had contemplated the dangers of his country. In regard to money, he was frugal, that he might be independent and that he might be generous. He owed good health to his exemplary temperance. Habitually gay, employment was his resource against weariness and sorrow, and contentment came from his superiority to ambition, interest, or vanity. There was about him more of moral greatness than appeared on the surface, and while he made no boast of unselfish benevolence, he would have surely met martyrdom had duty demanded it. The official conduct of Franklin and his intercourse with persons of highest rank were marked by the delicate propriety as well as by self-respect. His charm was simplicity, which gave grace to his style and ease to his manners. No lifelong courtier could have been more free from vulgarity, no diplomatist more true to his position as minister of a republic, no laborer more consistent with his former life as a workman, and thus he won respect and favor from all. When a celebrated cause was to be heard before the Parliament of Paris, the throng which filled the house and its approaches opened a way on his appearance, and he passed to the seat reserved for him amid the acclamations of the people. At the opera, at the theaters, similar honors were paid him. It is John Adams who said, and Adams was no great admirer of Franklin. Not Leibniz or Newton, not Frederick or Voltaire had a more universal reputation, and his character was more beloved and esteemed than that of them all. Throughout Europe, there was scarcely a citizen or peasant of any culture who was not familiar with his name and who did not consider him as a friend to all men. At the Academy, Alembert addressed him as one who had wrenched the thunderbolt from the cloud, the scepter from tyrants, and both these ideas were of a nature to pass easily into the common mind. From the part which he had taken in the emancipation of America, imagination transfigured him as the man who had separated the colonies from Great Britain, had framed their best constitutions of government, and by counsel and example would show how to abolish all political evil throughout the world.
Malesherbes spoke of the excellence of the institutions that permitted a printer, the son of a tallow chandler, to act a great part in public affairs. And if Malesherbes reasoned so, how much more the workmen of Paris and the people? Thus Franklin was the venerable impersonation of democracy, so calmly decorous, so free from a disposition to quarrel with the convictions of others, that while he was the delight of free-thinking philosophers, he escaped the hatred of the clergy, and his presence excited no jealousy in the old nobility. He remarked to those in Paris who learned of him the secret of statesmanship, "He who shall introduce into public affairs the principles of primitive Christianity will change the face of the world." And we know from Condorcet that he said in a public company,
You perceive liberty establish herself and flourish almost under your eyes. I dare to predict that by and by you will be anxious to taste her blessings." He was predicting the French Revolution. He was telling them to their faces that they would want what America had, and they did. In this way, he conciliated the most opposite natures, yet not for himself. Whatever favor he met in society, whatever honor he received from the Academy, whatever authority he gained as a man of science, whatever distinction came to him through the goodwill of the people, whatever fame he acquired throughout Europe, he turned to account for the good of his country. Surrounded by colleagues, some of whom were jealous of his superiority and for no service whatever were greedy of the public money, he threw their angry demands into the fire. Arthur Lee intrigued to supplant him. Izard maligned him with the strangeness of passionate frenzy, but he met their hostility by patient indifference. Never detracting from the merit of anyone, he did not disdain glory, and he knew how to pardon envy. Great as were the injuries which he received in England, he used toward that power undeviating frankness and fairness. In England, Rockingham, Richmond, Burke, Fox, and Conway desired to meet the offers of Franklin. So too did Lord North, though he was too selfish to be true to his convictions. On the other side stood the king. But for reasons which were hateful to the king, Chatham arrayed himself with inflexibility against American independence. Richmond, as a friend to liberty, made advances to Chatham, sending him the draft of an address which he was to move in the House of Lords, and entreating of him mutual confidence and support. Chatham rejected the overture and avowed the purpose of opposing the motion. Accordingly, on April 7th, against earnest requests, against the pleas of his family, against the warnings of his physicians, Lord Chatham came to the House of Lords. He was wrapped up in flannel to the knees, pale and wasted away, his eyes still retaining their fire. He came leaning upon his son, William Pitt, who would himself become one of Britain's greatest prime ministers, and his son-in-law, Lord Mahon. The peers stood up out of respect as he hobbled to his bench. This was the man who had made Britain great, the man who had won the 7 Years' War, the man who had conquered an empire, and he was dying. In the Duke of Richmond proposed and spoke elaborately in favor of an address to the king, which in substance recommended the recognition of the independent sovereignty of the 13 revolted provinces and a change of administration. Chatham, who alone of British statesmen had the right to invite America to resume her old connection, rose from his seat with slowness and difficulty, leaning on his crutches and supported under each arm by a friend. He seemed a being superior to those around him. Raising one hand from his crutch and casting his eyes toward heaven, he said, "I thank God that old and infirm and with more than 1 foot in the grave, I have been able to come this day to stand up in the cause of my country, perhaps never again to enter the walls of this house." Stillness prevailed. His voice, at first low and feeble, rose and became harmonious. But his speech faltered, his sentences were broken, his words were no more than flashes through darkness, shreds of sublime but unconnected eloquence.
He recalled his prophecies of the evils which were to follow such American measures as had been adopted, adding at the end of each, "and so it proved." He could not act with Lord Rockingham and his friends because they persisted in unretracted error. He laughed to scorn the idea of an invasion of England by Spain or by France or by both. If peace cannot be preserved with honor, why is not war declared without hesitation? This kingdom has still resources to maintain its just rights. Any state is better than despair. My lords, I rejoice that the grave has not closed upon me, that I am still alive to lift up my voice against the dismemberment of this ancient and most noble monarchy.
The Duke of Richmond answered with respect for the name of Chatham, so dear to Englishmen, but he resolutely maintained the wisdom of avoiding a war in which France and Spain would have America for their ally. Lord Chatham would have replied, but after 2 or 3 unsuccessful efforts to rise, he fell backward and seemed in the agonies of death. Every one of the peers pressed round him, save Mansfield, who sat unmoved. The senseless sufferer was borne from the house with tender solicitude to the bed from which he never was to rise. The greatest orator in British history had given his last speech, and it was a speech against recognizing American independence. He died defending the empire he had built, unable to accept that it was already gone. The king wrote at once to Lord North, "May not the political exit of Lord Chatham incline you to continue at the head of my affairs?" The world was saddened by the loss of so great a man. The elder Pitt never seemed more thoroughly the spokesman of the people of England than in the last months of his career. He came to Parliament with an all-impassioned love of liberty, the proudest sentiment of nationality, his old scorn for the House of Bourbon, and a burning passion for recovering the American colonies by reviving and establishing their rights. His eloquence in the early part of the session seemed to some of his hearers to surpass all that they had heard of the orators of Greece or Rome. In his last days, he was still hoping for a free England and a House of Commons truly representing the British people. With a haughtiness all the more marvelous from his age, decrepitude, and insulation, he confronted alone all branches of the nobility who had lost a continent in the vain hope of saving themselves a shilling in the pound of the land tax, and declared that there could be no good government but under an administration that should crush to atoms all parties of the aristocracy and interpret law in favor of liberty. He died like a hero struck down on the field of battle after the day was lost. In heart, more than ever, the great commoner. With logical consistency, the House of Lords refused to attend his funeral. They understood that he had stood against them, not with them, even at the end. By this time, the news of the French alliance with the United States had spread through Europe. It was received at St. Petersburg with lively satisfaction. In England, the king, the ministry, Parliament, the British nation, all were unwilling to speak the word independence, wishing at least to retain some preference by compact. Custom, mutual confidence, sameness of language and of civil law, the habit of using English manufactures, their cheapness and merit, of themselves secured to England almost a monopoly of American commerce for a generation, and yet she stickled for the formal concession of special commercial advantages.
Deluded by the long usage of monopoly, she would not see that equality was all she needed. Once more, Hartley, as an informal agent from Lord North, repaired to Paris to seek of Franklin an offer of some alliance, or at least of some favor in trade. Franklin answered him as he answered other emissaries, that the Americans enjoyed independence already. Its acknowledgment would secure to Britain equal but not superior advantages in commerce. Fox was satisfied with this offer, and on the 10th, when it was moved in the House of Commons to enlarge the powers of the commissioners, he held up to view that greater benefits to trade would follow from friendly relations with independent America than from nominal dependence. Fox was in the right, but was not heeded. Jackson, the former faithful agent of Connecticut, the fellow laborer with Franklin for the rights of the colonies, ever consistent with himself, even when he became Secretary of Grenville, refused to be of the Commission for Peace because he saw that it was a delusion accorded by the King to quiet Lord North and to unite the nation. Long before the commissioners arrived, the United States had taken its part. On April 21st, Washington gave his opinion to a member of Congress, and these words should be carved in stone. "Nothing short of independence can possibly do. A peace on any other terms would be a peace of war. The injuries we have received from the British nation were so unprovoked and have been so great and so many that they can never be forgotten. Our fidelity as a people, our character as men, are opposed to a coalition with them as subjects. The 22nd was a day of general public fasting and humiliation, with prayers to Almighty God to strengthen and perpetuate the Union. Assembled on that day in a house for public worship, Congress resolved to hold no conference or treaty with any commissioners on the part of Great Britain unless they shall, as a preliminary thereto, either withdraw their fleets and armies or in positive and express terms acknowledge the independence of the states. Lord North is 2 years too late with his political maneuver, responded George Clinton, then governor of New York. Jay met not a single American willing to accept peace under Lord North's terms. No offers, wrote Robert Morris, ought to have a hearing of one moment unless preceded by acknowledgement of our independence, because we can never be a happy people under their domination. Great Britain would still enjoy the greatest share and most valuable parts of our trade. Since Britain would grant no peace, on the 10th, the French king dispatched from Toulon a fleet bearing Girard as his minister to the Congress of the United States, that the alliance between France and America might be riveted. On the 29th, when in the presence of Franklin and his newly arrived colleague John Adams, Voltaire was solemnly received by the French Academy, philosophic France gave the right hand of fellowship to America as its child by adoption. The numerous assembly demanded a visible sign of this union, and in the presence of all that was most distinguished in letters and philosophy, Franklin and Voltaire kissed each other in recognition that the war for American independence was a war for freedom of mind. Two old men, one a printer from Philadelphia, the other the greatest writer in Europe, embracing before the assembled intellectuals of France. It was a moment that symbolized everything the Revolution meant. Many causes combined to procure the alliance of France and the American Republic, but the force which brought all influences harmoniously together, overruling the timorous levity of Maurepas and the dull reluctance of Louis XVI, was the movement of intellectual freedom. The spirit of free inquiry penetrated the Catholic world as it penetrated the Protestant world. Each of them methods of reform recognized that every man shares in the eternal reason. Luther, as he climbed on his knees the marble steps of a church in Rome, heard a voice within him cry out, "Justification is by faith alone," and he vindicated man's individuality from the point of view of religion. Descartes, meditating on the November night on the banks of the Danube, summoned each individual mind in the consciousness of its freedom to bring to judgment all tradition and all received opinion, and to prove all things, that it may hold fast only that which approves itself to be true.
A practical difference marked the kindred systems. The one was the method of continuity and gradual reform, the other of an instantaneous, complete, and thoroughly radical revolution. The principle of the Reformation waked up a superstitious world, asleep in lap of legends old, but did not renounce all external authority, and so it escaped premature conflicts. By the principle of Descartes, the individual man at once and altogether stood aloof from king, church, universities, public opinion, traditional science, all external authority, and all other beings, and turning every intruder out of the inner temple of the mind, kept guard at its portal to bar the entry to every belief that had not first obtained a passport from his own reason. No one ever applied the theory of Descartes with rigid inflexibility. A man can as little move without the weight of the superincumbent atmosphere as escape altogether the opinions of the age in which he sees the light. But the theory was there,
and it rescued philosophy from bondage to monkish theology, forbade to the Church all inquisition into private opinion, and gave to reason, and not to civil magistrates, the maintenance of truth. The nations that learned their lessons of liberty from Luther and Calvin went forward in their natural development, and their institutions grew and shaped themselves according to the increasing public intelligence. The nations that learned their lessons of liberty from Descartes were led to question everything and to attempt the renewal of society through the destruction of the past. The progress of liberty in all Protestant countries was marked by moderation. The German Lessing, the antitype of Luther, said to his countrymen, "Don't put out the candles till day breaks." America conducted a revolution on the highest principles of freedom with such circumspection that it seemed to be only a war against innovation. On the other hand, free thought in France, as pure in its source as free thought in America, became speculative and skeptical and impassioned. As it broke its chains, it started up with a sentiment of revenge against the terrorism and oppression which for centuries had sequestered the rights of mind and assumed to rule the world. Inquiry took up with zeal every question in science, politics, and morals. Free thought paid homage to the majesty of nature, investigated the origin of species, analyzed the air we breathe, pursued the discoveries of Columbus and Copernicus, mapped the skies, explored oceans and measured the earth, revived ancient learning, reveled in the philosophy of Greece which was untrammeled by national theology, nursed the republican sentiment by study of the history of Athens and Rome, spoke words for liberty on the stage, and adapted the round of learning to the common understanding. Now it translated and scattered abroad the new American constitutions, and the proud intellect of France was in a maze. Turgot and Condorcet melted with admiration and sympathy as they read the organic laws in which the unpretending lawgivers of a new continent had introduced into the world of real life the ideas that for them dwelt only in hope. All influences that favored freedom of mind conspired together. Anti-prelicatical Puritanism was embraced by anti-prelicatical skepticism. The exiled Calvin was welcomed home as he returned by way of New England and estates where Huguenots and Presbyterians prevailed. One great current of vigorous living opinion, which there was no power in France capable of resisting, swept through society, driving all the clouds in the sky in one direction. Ministers and king and nation were hurried along together.
The wave of free thought broke as it rolled against the Pyrenees. The Bourbon of France was compelled by the public opinion of France into an alliance with America. In Spain, no intellectual activity existed that could drive the Bourbon of Spain beyond the narrow range of thought in palaces. The Spanish people did not share the passion of the French, for they had not had the training of the French. In France, there was no Inquisition. In Spain, the king would have submitted his own son to its tribunal. Descartes, the philosophizing soldier of France, emancipated thought. Loyola, the contemplative soldier of Spain, organized repression. For the proud Cornell, so full of republican fire, Spain had the monkish Calderon. In Spain, no poet like Molière unfrocked hypocrisy. Not only had she no Calvin, no Voltaire, no Rousseau, she had no Pascal to mock at casuistry, no prelate to instruct her princes in the rights of the people like Fenelon, or defend her church against Rome, or teach the equality of all men before God like Bossuet. No controversies through the press like those with the Huguenots, no edict of toleration like that of Nantes. A richly endowed church always leans to Arminianism and justification by works. It was so in Spain, where the spiritual instincts of man, which are the life of freedom, had been trodden underfoot, and almsgiving to professed mendicants usurped the place of charity.
Natural science, in its progress, gently strips from religion the follies of superstition and purifies and spiritualizes faith. In Spain, it was dreaded as of kin to Islam. And as the material world was excluded from its rightful place among the objects of study, it avenged itself by overlaying religion. The idea was lost in the symbol. To the wooden or metal cross was imputed the worth of inward piety. Religious feeling was cherished by magnificent ceremonies to delight the senses. Penitents in this world made atonement by using the hair shirt, the scourge, and maceration. The immortal soul was thought to be purged by material flames. By the confessional, the merciless Inquisition kept spies over opinion in every house and quelled free thought by the dungeon, the torture, and the stake. Nothing was left in Spain that could tolerate Protestantism, least of all the stern Protestantism of America. Nothing congenial to free thought, least of all to free thought as it was in France. France was alive with the restless spirit of inquiry. The country beyond the Pyrenees was still numbed by superstition, priestcraft, and tyranny over mind, and the Church through its organization maintained a stagnant calm. As there was no union between the French mind and the Spanish mind, between the French people and the Spanish people, the union of the governments was simply the result of the family compact between its kings, which the engagement between France and the United States, without the assent of Spain, violated and annulled. The self-love of the Catholic king was touched that his nephew should have formed a treaty with America without waiting for his advice. The independence of colonies was an example that might divest his crown of its possessions in both parts of America, and he dreaded the establishment of republicanism on the border of his transatlantic provinces as more surely fatal than all the power of Great Britain. The King of France, while he declared his wish to make no conquest whatever in the war, vainly held out to the King of Spain, with the consent of the United States, the acquisition of Florida. But that province had not power to allure Charles III or his ministry, which was a truly Spanish ministry and wished to pursue a truly Spanish policy. There was indeed one word which, if pronounced, would be potent enough to alter their decision. That word was Gibraltar. But as it was not spoken, the King of Spain declared that he would not enter into the quarrel of France and England, that he wished to close his life in tranquility and valued peace too highly to sacrifice it to the interests or opinions of another. So the flags of France and the United States went together into the field against Great Britain, unsupported by any other government. The benefit then conferred on the United States was priceless. In return, the revolution in America brought to France new life and hope. If you enjoyed this deep dive into how France and America forged an alliance that changed the world, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more untold stories from the American Revolution.